Welcome to All Things Storybound, a creative outlet where any and all kinds of stories come to life.
From magical to mythical to mortifying, let us take you on a journey you've never experienced before.
Grab your favorite drink and get comfortable. You're in for a wild story ahead. Chapter 1.
The road to Willow Hollow was a winding, lonely thing, carved through miles of cornfields that stretched endlessly on either side. The stalks were unnaturally tall, their tops swaying lightly even in the absence of a breeze. Caleb adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as he glanced at his GPS. A single dot on the map marked the town's location, surrounded by blank space. It was as if the world forgot this place existed. Exactly the kind of story he wanted to write. Caleb was no stranger to offbeat assignments. As a freelance journalist, he had a knack for digging up tales that blended the peculiar with the human. When he'd first read about Willow Hollow's Harvest Moon Festival, a supposed time-honored tradition celebrating the bounty of the land, it had sounded like fluff. But the deeper he dug, the stranger it became. Accounts of outsiders attending the festival were scarce, and the ones he found were unnervingly vague. Yet every article spoke in awe about the town's unique cultural heritage. That mystery was why Caleb had driven 6 hours out of the city, into the heart of nowhere. As he crossed the town's welcome sign, painted wood, chipped letters spelling out Willow Hollow, established 1823. A faint unease crept over him. The town itself seemed trapped in time. Willow Hollow was picturesque in the way that postcards were. Neat rows of weathered houses with wide porches lined the streets. A white chapel stood in the distance, its steeple piercing the hazy sky. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, mixing with the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves. It should have been charming, but Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The streets were unusually quiet for midday, save for the occasional shuffle of footsteps as people hurried by, their heads down and shoulders hunched. No one greeted him. A pair of children playing with a ball in front of a house stopped when his car rolled past. They stared at him, their faces blank and unblinking until he turned the corner. His GPS announced his arrival at the town square. The area was alive with preparations for the festival. Wooden stalls being hammered together, pumpkins arranged in elaborate displays, and strings of lanterns stretched between the trees. Caleb parked his car and stepped out, the crisp autumn air biting at his cheeks. "Excuse me," he called to a man loading hay into a wagon. "I'm here for the festival. Could you tell me who I should talk to?" The man flinched at Caleb's voice, clutching the edge of the wagon. He looked at Caleb like a deer caught in headlights, his eyes darting to the scarecrow propped against the wagon. Its body was slumped, its burlap face stitched into a crude grin. Without a word, the man climbed onto the wagon and drove off, the wheels kicking up clouds of dust. Caleb frowned. Not the friendliest bunch, huh? He turned to find a young woman standing behind him, holding a basket of apples. She had auburn hair pulled into a messy braid and wore a plaid jacket that looked a size too big. Despite the warmth in her voice, she seemed uneasy, her fingers gripping the basket tightly. "Sorry about him," she said. "Folks around here don't trust strangers." "I noticed," Caleb replied, forcing a chuckle. "I'm Caleb, journalist. I'm here to write about the festival." Her brow furrowed at the word journalist, but she recovered quickly, offering a faint smile. "I'm May. You were here early. The main events don't start until tonight." "Thought I'd get a lay of the land first," Caleb said, glancing at the stalls. "Seems like a big deal." May hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the cornfields. "It is. The Harvest Moon Festival's been around for as long as anyone can remember. It's important to us." Her voice was careful, as if she were choosing her words with precision. Important how? Caleb pressed. May opened her mouth to answer, but a sharp whistle cut through the air. Across the square, an older woman stood on a porch, glaring at May and shaking her head. May stiffened, her grip on the basket tightening. I should go, she said hurriedly. Enjoy the festival, Caleb. Wait, he called after her. Can I ask you more questions later? May paused, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice was barely a whisper. Be careful. Not everything here is what it seems. And then she was gone, weaving through the square and disappearing into a side street. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had plenty of questions already, but no answers. The townsfolk were wary, their silence heavy with unspoken rules. And May, though she seemed willing to help, clearly had something to hide. He wandered the square, taking photos of the displays and jotting down notes. Everywhere he looked, there were scarecrows. Some stood propped against fences, others leaned casually in front of shops or sat on bales of hay. They were unnervingly lifelike, their clothes frayed and dirty, their faces twisted into grotesque expressions. By the time dusk fell, the square was bathed in the warm glow of lanterns, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Caleb watched as families gathered, their faces lit by the flickering light. The tension he'd felt earlier seemed to fade, replaced by an almost eerie cheerfulness. He spotted May near the bonfire, speaking with a group of children. She glanced at him briefly, but didn't approach. It was nearly 9 when Caleb decided to head back to his inn. He'd planned to interview more people, but the festival seemed to have an unspoken rule about prying eyes. As he walked through the streets, the sounds of laughter and music grew distant, replaced by the soft rustle of cornfields. The scarecrows were everywhere. Their forms loomed at the edges of the fields, silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. Caleb's footsteps slowed as he passed one standing unusually close to the road. Its head was tilted, its blank eyes stitched just a little too tight, giving it an expression of strange delight. He shuddered and quickened his pace, but the feeling lingered, a prickling sensation crawling up his spine. It was absurd, he told himself. They were just scarecrows, old cloth and straw. And yet, as he glanced back over his shoulder, he could have sworn their heads had turned, ever so slightly, to follow him.
Chapter 2.
The harvest moon hung heavy in the sky, its warm amber light spilling across Willow Hollow like a stage spotlight. The town square, lifeless during Caleb's arrival, had transformed into a bustling hive of activity. Strings of paper lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting flickering shadows across the cobblestone streets. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, cider, and freshly baked pies, mingling with the faint earthly tang of fallen leaves. Caleb strolled among the festival goers, his camera slung over one shoulder. He had to admit, for all its peculiarities, the town had created a stunning spectacle. Children darted through the crowd with painted faces, laughing as they dodged adults carrying armfuls of gourds and hay. A band played folk tunes near the bonfire, the haunting melody both cheerful and mournful, like something dredged up from the depths of history. Yet beneath the festive glow, that sense of unease lingered. Caleb paused at a stall where an elderly woman was carving intricate patterns into pumpkins. Her hands moved with surprising precision for someone her age, the blade glinting in the light. He crouched to snap a photo, adjusting the focus to capture the gnarled hands against the pumpkin's orange flesh. "Beautiful work," he said. The woman didn't respond. She glanced up briefly, her cloudy eyes narrowing as if she recognized him, then returned to her carving. Caleb straightened, uncomfortable under her gaze, and moved on. Further down the square, he found May standing near a table laden with steaming dishes. She smiled when she saw him, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Enjoying the festival?" she asked, her voice light but strained. It's impressive, Caleb admitted, taking in the spread before him. You all really go all out for this. May laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. It's tradition. We honor the land, the harvest, and everything it provides for us. Caleb reached for his notepad. Mind if I ask a few questions? I'd love to include some local insight in my article. May hesitated, her gaze flicking toward the bonfire where several townsfolk were gathered. Sure, she finally said, though her tone was reluctant. What can you tell me about the offering ceremony? Caleb asked, pen poised. May stiffened. Who told you about that? It's mentioned in a few articles I read, Caleb said, watching her reaction carefully. Something about an offering to ensure a good harvest? Sounds like an interesting tradition. May's face paled, and she opened her mouth to reply, but a voice cut her off. May! The same older woman from earlier stormed toward them, her face set in a scowl. She grabbed May by the arm, pulling her away from Caleb. Stop talking to him, the woman hissed, her voice low but harsh enough for Caleb to hear. He doesn't belong here. Caleb raised an eyebrow. I'm just doing my job, ma'am. The woman shot him a withering glare. Your job isn't welcome here. She turned and dragged May into the crowd, disappearing among the swirling lantern light. Caleb sighed, stuffing his notepad back into his pocket. The deeper he tried to dig, the more resistance he faced. Whatever the offering ceremony was, it clearly wasn't something the townsfolk wanted an outsider writing about. He continued exploring the festival, trying to shake off the tension. Near the bonfire, a group of townsfolk performed a traditional dance, their movements synchronized and deliberate. The music shifted, the rhythm becoming slower, almost hypnotic. Caleb watched, captivated by the eerie beauty of the scene, until his eyes drifted to the edge of the square. The Scarecrows were there. At first, he thought they were just part of the decorations. But the more he looked, the more unnatural they seemed. Unlike the Scarecrows he'd seen earlier, these weren't leaning against fences or posed in the fields. They were standing upright, as if they had walked into the square on their own. Their postures were disturbingly lifelike, arms bent at the elbows, heads tilted at odd angles. One even appeared to be holding a lantern. The longer Caleb stared, the more convinced he became that these weren't ordinary scarecrows. Shaking his head, he turned back to the crowd. He spotted May again, standing on the outskirts and clutching her basket of apples. She looked pale, her lips pressing into a thin line. You okay? He asked, approaching her. Caleb, she whispered, her voice urgent. You need to leave. He frowned. May, what's going on? Why is everyone so... Please, she interrupted, grabbing his arm. Just trust me. Get in your car and go before midnight. Caleb stared at her, trying to gauge whether her fear was genuine or just superstition. May, I'm not going anywhere until I get the full story. She shook her head, glancing over her shoulder. You don't understand. This isn't a game. If you're here when the moon reaches its peak... She trailed off, her grip tightening. Before he could press her further, someone called her name. She flinched and pulled away, disappearing into the crowd once more. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. The cryptic warnings and evasions were beginning to wear thin. He needed a break from the noise and the stifling atmosphere of the square. He wandered away from the festival, following a narrow dirt path that wound through the fields. The lanterns grew sparse, and the cheerful sounds of the festival faded, replaced by the rustle of corn stalks in the wind. That was when he saw the barn. It was old and weathered, its wooden slats warped and gray with age. A faint light flickered inside, visible through the gaps in the walls. Caleb hesitated, his curiosity warring with the growing sense of dread in his chest. Finally, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. a mix of damp straw and something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit. The interior was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a beam, its light casting long shadows across the room. Scarecrows lined the walls. At least, he thought they were scarecrows. They were dressed in ragged clothes, their heads covered with burlap sacks or crudely carved gourds, but their limbs, they were too realistic. The way the joints bent, the texture of the skin, like material poking through the gaps in the fabric, it was all wrong. Caleb stepped closer, his heart hammering. One of the scarecrows slumped slightly to the side, as if it had been hastily propped up. A faint, sickly odor wafted from it, and he noticed dark stains on the cuffs of the shirt. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric. The scarecrow twitched. Caleb stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at it again, frozen, waiting for it to move again. But it remained still, its head tilted at a grotesque angle, the mouth stitched, grinning mockingly. As Caleb turned to leave, he heard a faint, muffled scream from one of the scarecrows.
Chapter 3.
The muffled scream echoed in Caleb's mind long after he left the barn. He stumbled through the fields, his flashlight's beam trembling as it cut through the tall stalks of corn. The festival's cheerful noise was faint and distant, barely audible over the wind that hissed through the dry leaves. He couldn't shake the image of the scarecrow twitching, its grotesque grin mocking him. Something was deeply wrong in Willow Hollow, and he needed answers. He found May near the edge of the square, standing under the glow of a paper lantern. She was alone, clutching her basket of apples like a lifeline, her gaze fixed on the ground. When she saw him, her face fell. "May," Caleb said, his voice low but urgent, "we need to talk." She shook her head, stepping back. "You shouldn't be here, Caleb." "I'm already here," he shot back, frustration lacing his words. "You need to tell me what's going on. What's in that barn? What's the deal with the scarecrows? And what the hell is this offering everyone keeps avoiding?" May glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to overhear. "I told you to leave," she whispered. "Why didn't you listen?" "Because I'm not running without knowing what I'm running from." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Please, May, I need to know the truth." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment she looked impossibly tired. She gestured for him to follow her, and together they slipped away from the square, weaving through narrow alleyways until they reached the shelter of an old shed. The air inside smelled of dust and hay, and the dim light barely illuminated May's pale face. "You shouldn't have come here," she began, her voice shaking. "This place, it isn't like other towns. We're not free, Caleb. We haven't been for a long time." "What does that mean?" Caleb asked, though he already felt the weight of the answer pressing down on him. May took a deep breath. "The festival is a lie," she said. "We don't celebrate the harvest. We survive it." Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. "There's something beneath the town," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something ancient. We call it the Hollow. It's always been here, as far as anyone remembers. It controls the land, the crops, the weather, everything. Without it, Willow Hollow wouldn't exist. But it doesn't give without taking." Caleb's stomach churned. What does it take? May's eyes met his, and he saw the answer in her haunted expression. People. He staggered back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "That's what the scarecrows are, isn't it?" he said, his voice rising. "They're not decorations. They're sacrifices." May nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Every year, we offer someone to the Hollow. It demands blood. Fresh blood. If we don't give it what it wants, the crops fail. The livestock dies. People starve. Caleb's mind raced as he pieced it together. And the festival, the music, the food, it's all just to lure people here. We don't have a choice, May said, her voice breaking. It's the only way to keep the town alive. Caleb's chest tightened as realization struck. That's why everyone's been avoiding me, he said, his throat dry. I'm the offering this year, aren't I? May didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence said everything. May, Caleb said, his voice hardening. You have to help me get out of here. I can't, she whispered, her hands trembling. If you leave, it'll punish us all. It'll take someone else. Maybe more than one. I can't. Damn it, May, Caleb snapped. You think I'm just going to stand here and let myself get slaughtered? A sharp noise outside cut him off. Footsteps. Voices. They know you're gone, May said, panic rising in her voice. They'll come for you. You have to run. Before he could respond, the shed door creaked open, revealing two figures silhouetted against the lantern light. One held a scythe, its blade catching the glow. There he is, one of them said, his voice calm but chilling. Caleb didn't wait to see what they'd do next. He bolted, crashing through the cornfields as shouts erupted behind him. The stalks whipped against his face and arms, their dry leaves cutting like blades. He could hear the townspeople giving chase, their footsteps heavy and unrelenting. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Caleb, a voice called out, almost taunting. He ignored it, his lungs burning as he pushed himself faster. The flashlight bounced wildly in his hand, its beam slicing through the darkness. Ahead, he spotted a gap in the stalks, a clearing. He burst through it, only to skid to a halt. In the center of the clearing was a trapdoor, its wooden frame barely visible beneath a layer of soil and weeds. It looked old, the hinges rusted and caked with dirt. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before dropping to his knees and yanking it open. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up, and a dark hole yawned beneath him, its depths unknowable. Footsteps closed in behind him. Without thinking, Caleb climbed down, gripping the edges of the opening as he lowered himself into the darkness. His boots hit solid ground, and he crouched, his breathing ragged. The trapdoor slammed shut above him, plunging him into complete darkness. For a moment, all he could hear was his own heartbeat, thundering in his ears. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but they grew louder, overlapping and echoing. Caleb fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal a tunnel. The walls were made of packed earth, but they pulsed faintly, as if alive. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves. They weren't words exactly, but they filled Caleb's mind with images, faces twisted in agony, hands clawing at the soil, roots wrapping around limp bodies and pulling them into the depths. He pressed forward, his steps hesitant. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Caleb felt the weight of something massive and malevolent pressing down on him. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its walls glistening with moisture. At the center was a massive, writhing mass of roots and tendrils, pulsing like a living heart. The air buzzed with energy, and Caleb felt it vibrating in his chest. He took a step closer, his flashlight illuminating their grotesque form. It was as if the roots were feeding on something. Someone. He could see fragments of clothing, bones tangled in the mass. The ground beneath him trembled. Caleb staggered back, his flashlight flickering. The whispers became a roar, a deafening cacophony that drowned out his thoughts. And then, from the darkness of the lair, something began to rise.
Chapter 4.
The tunnel seemed to breathe. Each step Caleb took sent a faint vibration through the ground, as if the earth itself were alive and aware of him. The walls shimmered faintly under the weak beam of his flashlight, their slick, pulsing surface resembling raw flesh more than soil. The whispers he had heard before were stronger now, insistent murmurs that seemed to curl around him like smoke. Caleb. The voice startled him, low and rasping, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. He swung the flashlight wildly, its beam slicing through the darkness. The tunnel stretched endlessly in both directions, offering no escape. He pressed forward, his breaths shallow and ragged. He didn't know what he was looking for. He only knew he couldn't go back. As he moved deeper into the earth, the air grew colder and heavier, carrying a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The ground beneath his boots grew soft, squelching with each step, and the walls began to change. Tendrils of dark roots snaked through the dirt, pulsing faintly with a sickly green light. Caleb's flashlight flickered as if reacting to the energy in the air. The whispers shifted, becoming sharper, more distinct. Help us. Run. Join us. Caleb gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus on the path ahead. But when his foot caught on something, sending him sprawling forward, the flashlight tumbled from his hand, landing with a dull clatter. He scrambled to retrieve it, his fingers brushing against something cold and brittle. Lifting the beam, he saw what had tripped him. A skeletal arm, half buried in the dirt. Caleb recoiled, his stomach lurching. The remains were tangled in the roots, as if they had been dragged into the walls themselves. Shreds of tattered fabric clung to the bones, dark with stains that could only be blood. Nearby, other remnants lay scattered. Broken tools, rusted knives, and what looked like a child's shoe, its leather warped and discolored. This wasn't a tunnel. It was a graveyard. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These were the offerings, victims consumed by whatever lurked beneath Willow Hollow. Caleb. He froze at the sound of his name. This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was clear and familiar. May? He called, his voice trembling. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, stepping into the faint glow of his flashlight. It was May, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear. She clutched her basket of apples like a shield, though many had fallen out and rolled across the ground. What are you doing here? He demanded, his voice harsher than he intended. I came to help you, she said, her voice shaking. You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous. Dangerous? Caleb snapped, gesturing to the remains around them. You don't say. What the hell is this place, May? What is this thing? May hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. It's the Hollow, she said finally. It's not just beneath the town. It is the town. Everything grows because of it. Everything survives because of it. But it feeds on us, on our fear, our pain. And you are okay with that? Caleb asked, his anger rising. You just let it happen. You think I want this? May shot back, her voice breaking. Do you think any of us do? My family's been here for generations. We don't have a choice. None of us do. Caleb stared at her, his flashlight casting deep shadows across her face. He wanted to believe her, but the image of the townsfolk smiling eerily, the way they had him hunted through the fields, it was impossible to shake. Why are you really here, May? He asked, narrowing his eyes. How do I know I can trust you? May stepped closer, her expression pleading. Because I'm not like them. I don't want you to die, Caleb. I want this to stop. But we have to do it together. We have to destroy it. He hesitated, his instincts warring with his desperation. Finally, he nodded. How? May glanced down the tunnel. We have to find its heart. That's where its power comes from. If we can destroy it, maybe the town can finally be free. Maybe, Caleb repeated, his skepticism clear. It's all we've got, May said. Come on. They moved together through the tunnels, the walls growing more grotesque with each step. The roots were thicker here, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm that matched the pounding in Caleb's ears. The whispers had become a cacophony, a symphony of despair that seemed to press against his skull. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened into a cavern. Caleb stopped in his tracks, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The heart of the hollow was a grotesque, writhing mass of roots and flesh, its surface glistening with moisture. It pulsed like a living thing, emitting a low, rhythmic hum that resonated in Caleb's chest. Tendrils stretched outward, snaking through the walls and ceiling, feeding the tunnels with its vile energy. May's breath hitched beside him. That's it, she whispered. Caleb took a step closer, the flashlight's beam illuminating the heart's surface. He could see faces trapped within it, distorted, screaming faces pressing against the flesh-like exterior, their mouths frozen in eternal agony. Jesus Christ, he muttered, bile rising in his throat. May reached into her basket and pulled out a small glass bottle filled with clear liquid. It's kerosene, she said, answering the unspoken question. I brought it in case we found this. She began dousing the heart, the liquid splashing against its surface. The heart shuddered, its tendrils writhing in protest, and the whispers turned to anguished screams. Caleb winced, his hands shaking as she pulled a pack of matches from his pocket. Yeah, I thought that wasn't right. I was like, wait. Caleb winced, his hands shaking as he pulled a pack of matches from his pocket. Are you sure this will work? He asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. May didn't answer. May, he said, turning to her. Are you sure? Her expression was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the heart. Light it, she said softly. Caleb struck the match, the tiny flame flickering in the darkness. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then stepped forward, ready to ignite the kerosene-soaked mass. As he leaned closer, May's voice cut through the chaos, soft and calm. You think fire can kill a god?
Chapter 5.
The match fell from Caleb's hand, the tiny flame flickering as it tumbled through the air. When it hit the kerosene-soaked roots of the hollow's heart, the effect was immediate. Flames exploded outward in an instant, devouring the writhing mass of roots and flesh with a furious hunger. The cavern was bathed in a hellish orange glow as tendrils writhed and twisted, their movements jerky and desperate. The heart pulsed violently, emitting a guttural scream that shook the walls around them. Caleb stumbled backward, shielding his face from the blistering heat. The ground beneath him heaved like a living thing, threatening to send him sprawling. May, he shouted, turning to her, we have to get out of here. But May was gone. He turned in frantic circles, the flashlight's beam swinging wildly as he searched the cavern. She had been right behind him, he was certain of it. Now there was nothing but flames and shadows, the roar of fire nearly drowning out the tortured screams of the hollow. A tremor rolled through the cavern, and Caleb felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Cracks spiderwebbed through the floor, and chunks of earth began to fall from the ceiling. Damn it, he muttered, his breath ragged as he turned and ran. The tunnel twisted and turned, but every direction looked the same. Pulsing walls, flickering shadows, and the relentless heat of the fire spreading behind him. The whispers that had once filled the air were gone, replaced by the furious shrieks of the hollow as it thrashed against its impending destruction. Another tremor nearly sent him sprawling, and Caleb caught himself against the wall, his palms sinking into the pulsing roots. He yanked his hand away, his stomach churning as the slimy texture clung to his skin. The tunnel began to collapse, the walls caving in as roots twisted and died. Caleb forced himself forward, ignoring the burning in his lungs and legs. The exit had to be close. It had to be. The flicker of moonlight through the roots spurred him on, and Caleb burst through the trapdoor into the open air. He gasped, gulping in the cool night air as he collapsed onto his hands and knees. The cornfield was still, the stalks swaying gently in the breeze as though nothing had happened. For a moment, Caleb allowed himself to believe he had made it, that he had survived. Then he noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a small town at night. It was oppressive, heavy, the kind of silence that filled a room when something was waiting. Caleb pushed himself to his feet, his flashlight still clutched in his trembling hand. The rows of corn seemed endless in the pale light of the harvest moon, and he turned in slow circles, searching for a sign of May, of the townsfolk, of anything similar. He didn't have to look for long. They were waiting for him. At the edge of the field, the townsfolk stood in a perfect circle, their faces lit by the soft glow of lanterns. They watched him silently, their expressions eerily calm. The same people who had laughed and danced at the festival now stood motionless, their eyes fixed on him with an unsettling intensity. Caleb's breath hitched. His first instinct was to run, but there was nowhere to go. The circle stretched as far as he could see, an impenetrable wall of human bodies. "Congratulations," a voice said, breaking the silence. Caleb turned to see May stepping into the clearing, her basket of apples in hand. She looked unscathed, untouched by the chaos of the tunnels. Her hair was neatly braided, her face calm and serene. "May," Caleb said, relief flooding his voice. "Thank God, we need to—" "Stop." Her voice was cold, commanding, and it froze him in his tracks. "You don't get it, do you?" she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "You think you've won, that you destroyed it. But this was never about destroying the Hollow." Caleb stared at her, his mind racing to catch up. "What are you talking about?" May stepped closer, her expression almost pitying. "The Hollow doesn't feed on fire or pain, Caleb. It feeds on fear, on despair. The flames you set? They didn't destroy it. They only made it stronger." "No," Caleb whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible. You said—" "I said we needed to destroy it," May interrupted. "And we did. You just didn't understand how." The circle of townsfolk stepped closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Caleb stumbled back, his heart pounding. "You were the offering, Caleb," May said, her voice soft but firm. "Everything you felt tonight, your fear, your hopelessness, that was the real sacrifice. The Hollow thrives on it. And now, it's complete." "No," Caleb said, his voice rising. "You lied to me. You said you wanted to help me." "I did," May replied, tilting her head. "But not in the way you thought." The ground beneath Caleb's feet began to shift. He looked down and saw roots snaking toward him, twisting around his boots and binding him in place. "No," he shouted, struggling against the tendrils. "Let me go." The townsfolk watched silently as the roots climbed higher, wrapping around his legs and pulling him down. Caleb clawed at the ground, his fingers sinking into the dirt, but it was no use. Don't fight it, May said, her voice almost gentle. It's easier if you don't. The roots climbed higher, wrapping around his torso, his arms, his neck. He could feel them tightening, constricting his chest, making it harder to breathe. The lanterns around the circle flickered, casting shadows across the faces of the townsfolk. Please, Caleb gasped, his voice barely audible. Don't do this. May knelt beside him, her expression unreadable. She reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from his face. It's already done, she said softly. As the roots reached his face, Caleb's vision blurred. He looked up at the sky, the harvest moon glowing brighter than ever. Its light seemed to pulse, growing redder with each passing moment, until it bathed the entire field in crimson. The roots crept over his eyes, and the last thing he saw was May's face, calm and serene, framed by the blood-red moon.